At 4:47 on the morning of March 19, 1937, Walter Hogan's Caterpillar RD6 bulldozer sat idling at the north edge of the Bonneville Dam construction site, 40 miles east of Portland, Oregon. The machine weighed 13,840 pounds. Its three-cylinder D6 600 engine produced 45 horsepower and burned through diesel at a rate that would make modern operators wince. Hogan, 34 years old, had been operating heavy equipment since he was 19. He'd worked on levees in Louisiana, cut roads through Montana timber, and spent 2 years on the Hoover Dam before coming north to the Columbia River Gorge. His hands bore the scars of broken cables and hot metal. His back ached from 10-hour shifts, but the 50 cents per hour wage, depression rates that felt like prosperity, kept him showing up at dawn. The Bonneville site sprawled across both shores of the Columbia River, a massive construction zone that employed 3,000 men working 3 shifts around the clock. The Army Corps of Engineers had chosen this location because bedrock lay close to the surface. What they knew but didn't advertise was that the entire area sat atop the ancient Bonneville Landslide, a catastrophic slope failure from around 1450 AD that had temporarily dammed the Columbia and created a lake stretching 200 miles upstream. The geology was unstable. Clay layers beneath Columbia River basalt created perfect conditions for sliding. But the engineers had drilled exploratory holes and found fractured rock suspended in micaceous sand and gravel. They built anyway. The nation needed electricity. The Depression needed jobs. Hogan's bulldozer had been delivered 6 weeks earlier, fresh from Caterpillar's Peoria factory. The RD6 designation would change to D6 later that year, but in March 1937 it was still new nomenclature for a relatively new machine. The blade measured 8 feet wide. Steel tracks distributed the machine's weight across a footprint that could traverse mud other vehicles couldn't touch. Hogan used it to push excavated volcanic rock into disposal piles, to level access roads, to clear debris from cofferdam sites where workers were blocking off half the river at a time to reach bedrock. On this particular morning, he'd been assigned to work the upper embankment where the powerhouse would eventually stand. The site superintendent, a man named Carson who'd built railroads across 3 continents, had ordered extra grading work. Unusual amounts of water had been seeping from the hillside above the construction zone. Nothing catastrophic, just persistent moisture that made the supervisors nervous. 26 men had already died during construction. Carson didn't want more names on that list. Hogan positioned his bulldozer facing west, parallel to the slope. Dawn light hadn't yet reached into the gorge. Work lights strung across the construction site cast harsh shadows. Below him, the night shift was transitioning to day shift. Men emerged from the workers' village, a temporary town of wooden barracks built specifically for this project. They carried lunch pails. They wore hard hats that wouldn't save them from what was about to happen. At 4:51 a.m., Hogan felt it before he saw it. A vibration transmitted through the bulldozer's chassis that wasn't engine harmonics. He'd felt this before on unstable ground. Years of experience translated sensation into knowledge. Something was moving that shouldn't be. He looked upslope, the hillside above the construction site. 200 vertical feet of basalt and clay and timber was sliding. Not fast, not the dramatic collapse you'd see in a movie. Just inexorable movement, the entire slope shifting downward at walking speed but with the momentum of millions of tons. Trees tilted. Rock faces that had been stable for centuries cracked along new fault lines. The ancient landslide complex was reactivating. Below him, 3,000 men were positioned directly in the slide path. Hogan had perhaps 90 seconds before the slide reached the construction zone. Maybe 2 minutes before it would sweep across the powerhouse excavation, the cofferdam sites, the worker village, and bury everything in fractured basalt and mud. The Columbia River itself would be temporarily dammed, again flooding upstream areas and potentially destroying communities all the way to Cascade Locks. A quick word. That subscribe button below, it tells me these stories matter to you, that the effort to bring them forward reach someone. It's a small action, but it means everything. And if you want longer stories, members get exclusive 20-plus minute documentaries. If you want to see how Walter Hogan turned 13,000 pounds of steel and diesel into a last line of defense, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to the slide. Hogan did three things simultaneously. He dropped the blade, he opened the throttle to maximum, and he drove straight up the slope toward the moving mass. The RD6 could climb a 40-degree grade under ideal conditions. This wasn't ideal. The ground was unstable, shell already shifting beneath the tracks. But Hogan understood something most people wouldn't. The slide was following the clay layer. If he could reach that layer and pile enough material perpendicular to the slide direction, he might create enough resistance to redirect it. Not stop it. That was impossible. But maybe deflect it, maybe send it sideways instead of straight down into the populated zone. Behind him, men were starting to realize something was wrong. A foreman named Dutch Peters saw the bulldozer climbing toward danger and started blowing his whistle, the emergency evacuation signal. 3 short blasts. Pause. 3 more. Men looked up, saw the hillside moving, started running. But 3,000 men don't evacuate instantly. They're spread across a work zone covering 40 acres. Some are deep in excavations. Others are inside partially built structures. The closest men had maybe 90 seconds to clear the impact zone. The furthest might need 4 minutes. Hogan reached the moving mass at 4:53 a.m. The bulldozer's blade bit into shifting earth. He worked the machine like a man possessed, cutting perpendicular to the slide direction, pushing material upslope and to the sides. The physics were brutal. For every cubic yard he moved, thousands more were sliding past him. But he wasn't trying to stop the entire slide. He was trying to create a ridge, a pressure point that would make the sliding mass choose the path of least resistance. So the clay layer was 15 feet below surface. Hogan dug. The RD6's 45 horses strained against geological forces that measured in megatons. Steel tracks chewed through basalt. The transmission, a friction clutch system that would seem primitive by modern standards, somehow held. Hogan knew that if the bulldozer tipped sideways, if the tracks lost purchase, if anything broke, he was dead. The slide would bury him in his machine and keep moving. At 4:56 a.m., something shifted. Well, not the catastrophic acceleration you'd expect when a landslide reaches critical velocity. The opposite. The mass behind Hogan's bulldozer hit the ridge he'd created and began deflecting east away from the main construction zone. Not all of it. Physics doesn't work that cleanly, but enough. The slide split, part of it following its original trajectory, part of it veering toward an area that had been cleared of workers just days earlier. Dutch Peters, watching from below, later said it looked like Moses parting a sea of rock. The slide that hit the construction zone was perhaps 30% of what it would have been. Enough to destroy equipment, enough to bury access roads, enough to send the Columbia River surging 10 feet higher and flood downstream areas, but not enough to bury 3,000 men. Hogan rode the bulldozer down the slope as the slide energy dissipated. He'd been operating on the moving mass for 6 minutes. The RD6's engine was overheating. Just hydraulic fluid was leaking from stressed seals. One track had lost 2 plates, but it kept running. He parked the machine at the edge of the damage zone and shut it down. His hands were shaking. He lit a cigarette with fingers that barely worked. The final accounting took 3 days. 17 men injured, none fatally. 400,000 cubic yards of material had slid. Equipment losses totaled $63,000, significant money in 1937. The project timeline was pushed back 3 weeks. But the casualty list that should have read in the hundreds instead read 0, dead. The Army Corps of Engineers investigated. Their report, filed April 2, 1937, attributed the limited damage to fortuitous geological factors and rapid evacuation procedures. Hogan's name appeared once in a footnote about equipment positioning. The Caterpillar RD6 was repaired and returned to service. Bonneville Dam was completed in September 1937. President Franklin Roosevelt dedicated it on September 28th. Some of the dam's powerhouse began generating electricity in 1938. The navigation lock that opened that same year was the highest single-lift lock in the world, 60 feet of vertical lift. The entire project cost $83 million and would eventually power 500,000 homes. Walter Hogan continued operating bulldozers until 1956. He worked on Grand Coulee Dam. He cut roads through the Cascade Range. He never spoke publicly about the Bonneville incident. When asked, he'd say he was just doing his job. The RD6 designation officially changed to D6 in late 1937. Showed the model evolve through multiple iterations, eventually becoming one of Caterpillar's most successful medium bulldozers. By 1959, 60,000 D6 tractors had been built. The specific machine Hogan operated on March 19, 1937, was scrapped in 1943 after its frame cracked during heavy use on another project. The geology at Bonneville remained unstable. During construction of the second powerhouse in the 1970s, engineers encountered the same fractured basalt and clay layers. They built differently, and with deeper foundations and extensive rock anchoring. Parts of the Cascade Landslide complex are still moving today at rates measured in centimeters per year. The worker village where 3,000 men lived during construction was dismantled in 1938. The site is now under 20 feet of water, submerged by the reservoir created when the dam closed. Photographs survive. They show wooden barracks, mess halls, a small hospital, streets laid out in grid patterns. Our temporary civilization built to accomplish permanent work. Dutch Peters, the foreman who blew the evacuation whistle, submitted a safety report recommending geological monitoring equipment. The Army Corps implemented some of his suggestions. Modern dam construction includes real-time slope monitoring, ground-penetrating radar, automated evacuation systems. The lessons cost $63,000 in 1937. They've prevented uncounted casualties since. The Bonneville Project Act, signed by Roosevelt on August 20, 1937, created the Bonneville Power Administration. The BPA marketed power at $17.50 per kilowatt year, roughly 0.2 cents per kilowatt hour. That rate held for 28 years. Rural electrification transformed the Pacific Northwest. Aluminum plants, shipyards. Portland grew from a timber town into a manufacturing center. All of it powered by water flowing through the turbines that Hogan's bulldozer helped make possible. There's no monument to Walter Hogan at Bonneville Dam. See, the visitor center doesn't mention the March 1937 slide. Park rangers who give tours focus on Roosevelt's dedication speech, on the engineering marvel of the spillway, on the fish ladders that let salmon navigate around the dam. History compresses. Details disappear. But in the Army Corps of Engineers archives in Portland, there's a photograph. March 20th, 1937. A Caterpillar RD6 bulldozer sits at an angle on a slope of disturbed earth. One track is damaged. The blade is caked with clay. In the background, you can see the extent of the slide, a scar across the hillside where ancient geology reasserted itself. The photograph has a caption typed on Corps letterhead, Equipment Recovery, March 1937 Incident. No operator listed, no context provided, just a machine that shouldn't have been where it was, operated by a man who understood that sometimes the only thing standing between disaster and catastrophe is someone willing to drive toward danger instead of away from it. 13,000 pounds of steel and diesel, 45 horsepower, 6 minutes of operation. The mathematics of survival don't always calculate the way engineers predict. Walter Hogan died in 1978 in Olympia, Washington, age 75. His obituary mentioned his work on major dam projects throughout the Pacific Northwest. It noted his 40 years in the heavy equipment industry. It listed his children and grandchildren. It didn't mention that on a cold morning in March 1937, he saved 4,000 lives. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Your support helps us preserve these histories. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from.